Dorian Voss died on a Tuesday, which struck me as fitting, since Tuesdays are when nothing interesting is supposed to happen. He was found at 9:40 in the evening, alone in his office, on the 11th floor of the Ashcombe and Vane Assurance Group, slumped over a desk covered in numbers he'd apparently been writing, until the moment his heart decided to quit. Except his heart didn't quit on its own. That much came out later, but I'm getting ahead of Archie Goodwin's own timeline, which is a bad habit Wolfe's always correcting me on. Here's what the responding officers found, and here's what nobody could explain. First, a chess clock on the corner of Voss's desk, the kind with 2 faces and a plunger, stopped dead at 6:47. Voss didn't play chess. Nobody in the office had ever seen him near a board. The clock wasn't a house object. It was new, still had a price tag stuck to the felt bottom, $41.80, from a hobby shop on Lexington. Second, a single sheet of paper, torn from what turned out to be his own life insurance policy. His own, mind you, not a client's, folded with surprising precision into the shape of a crane, sitting on top of his keyboard like a paperweight. Whoever folded it knew what they were doing. It wasn't a nervous doodle. It was origami, deliberate and clean, the kind of thing you practice. Third, and this is the one that got under my skin, a column of 7 numbers written in red ink on the inside of his own left forearm, in his own handwriting, according to the 2 document examiners who looked at it before I ever laid eyes on the body. 7 numbers, no decimal points, no labels, just numbers, marching down his arm like a ledger nobody was ever meant to read comfortably. The official cause of death, at first pass, was myocardial infarction. Natural causes, tragic but unremarkable. A 49-year-old man with a stressful job and a family history the ME's report politely called significant. Case closed, more or less, until Voss's widow decided that a happily married actuary with a clean bill of health 3 weeks prior doesn't just fold up and die at his desk on a Tuesday with a hobby shop chess clock as company. She was right to wonder. That's not spoiler material. That's just how these things work when Nero Wolfe gets a phone call. Ashcombe and Vane isn't the kind of firm that makes headlines. It sits quietly in a building full of quiet firms, doing what actuaries do, running mortality tables, pricing risk, telling insurance companies how many of their policyholders will die in a given year, and roughly when, so premiums can be set to keep everybody comfortable and nobody suspicious. It's a business built entirely on numbers that predict death without ever touching it. Voss had worked there 19 years. Senior actuary, the kind of man who color-coded his spreadsheets and brought the same turkey sandwich every day, according to the doorman who'd watched him do it since the Clinton administration. I didn't know any of that yet. Sitting at my desk in the brownstone on a Wednesday morning, with the mail unsorted, and Wolfe not yet down from the plant rooms. All I knew was that the phone had rung twice already, and the second time, the voice on the other end had said the name Dorian Voss like it was a debt she intended to collect. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She had an 11 o'clock appointment she hadn't yet scheduled, and by the sound of her, she wasn't the type to be told no. I should have guessed, right then, that whatever this case turned out to be, it wasn't going to be about jealousy or an old grudge dressed up as tragedy. Voss's death had the smell of something colder, something that didn't care who Voss was at all. I just didn't know yet how right I'd turn out to be. Bramble caught it before I did, 10:30, and he came off the rug by the window like he'd been shot from it, ears up, nose working, doing that slow, deliberate circle he does when someone's coming up the stoop who matters. I've learned not to argue with the dog. 15 seconds later, the bell rang. Eleanor Voss stood on the doorstep in a charcoal coat that hadn't been chosen that morning by accident. A woman who dresses for war knows exactly what she's doing. Whistler met her in the hall the way he meets everyone, unhurried, a long study before he commits to anything. He sat. He didn't lean into her hand when she offered it, but he didn't pull away either. Cautious approval, in Whistler's language. Grief that hadn't curdled into something uglier. I filed that away. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, before I'd even gotten her coat. "I need to speak with Nero Wolfe, today, not next week. He's with his orchids until 11, I said. After that, he's difficult, in a whole different way. Sit down, Mrs. Voss. Coffee, or something stronger?" She sat, like the chair owed her money. "Didn't want coffee," Wanted, in her words. Someone who isn't going to tell me my husband's heart just stopped for no reason. Wolfe came down at 11:06, which is to say 6 minutes late by his own clock. Orchid dust still faintly visible on his cuffs, an irritation he wears like other men wear cologne. He lowered himself into the one chair built to hold him, and regarded Mrs. Voss the way he regards most new clients, as an inconvenience that might, eventually, prove interesting enough to justify itself. "Madam," he said, "Archie tells me your husband died 3 days ago, of a coronary event, and that you dispute this." "I don't dispute what killed him," she said. "The doctors can call it whatever they like. I dispute that it happened on its own." Wolfe's eyes didn't move, but something in his stillness sharpened. That's the tell with him. Not motion, but the absence of it. "Go on," she told it plainly, which I respected. Voss had been in perfect health 3 weeks prior. A physical for a term life renewal, clean as a whistle. His own company's underwriters had signed off on him. No history of cardiac trouble beyond a father who died at 81 of something unrelated. He didn't smoke. He ran 4 miles on Saturdays. And 3 nights before he died, he'd come home rattled, her word, and told her he'd found something in the numbers at work that he needed to walk back through, carefully, before he said anything to anyone. "What numbers?" Wolfe asked. He wouldn't say. He said it wasn't finished. He said, she stopped, and for a moment, the charcoal armor slipped. He said if he was right, it wasn't going to be a small thing. And then he told me not to worry, which is what he always said right before I had every reason to. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment. Then, the chess clock, the paper crane, the numbers on his arm. "Archie has described these to me. Had your husband ever, in 19 years of employment, expressed any interest in chess, in origami, or in the practice of writing calculations upon his own skin?" "No," she said. "None of it. That's why I called you instead of a lawyer." Wolfe grunted. His particular grunt, the one that means a case, has just become worth his beer. "One detail interests me above the others, madam. The clock was purchased new, not borrowed, not found in a drawer. Purchased, with a receipt still attached. Someone brought that clock into your husband's office with deliberate intention. That is not the signature of a heart attack. That is the signature of a stage being dressed. Then you'll help." "I will investigate," Wolfe said, which from him is nearly a proposal of marriage. "Archie will require access to your husband's office, his desk, his correspondence, and a list of every person who might have had reason to enter that room after hours. Fritz will show you out." "Good day, madam, and my sympathies, which I offer rarely, and mean when I do." Ashcombe and Vane occupied the whole 11th floor, glass offices around a beige core, the kind of place where the carpet absorbs sound so thoroughly you could scream and nobody 3 desks over would notice. I got there at 2, flashed a card that overstated my relationship with an insurance fraud investigation, and was walking the floor with a company handler named Priya Nandan by 2:15. Voss's office sat at the corner, blinds still drawn from whatever the police had left them at. The desk had been cleared for evidence, but the room still had that particular hush that settles into a space when its occupant isn't coming back for the turkey sandwich. "Everyone's shaken," Priya told me. "But I should tell you, nobody's exactly weeping into their spreadsheets." That's a phrase that earns follow-up questions. Marcus Thane, the department head, gave me 11 controlled minutes in a glass office with a view of nothing. He talked about Voss with the careful warmth of a man delivering a eulogy he'd rehearsed. Brilliant with the tables. A little obsessive lately. Kept flagging discrepancies in a mortality data set none of the rest of us could get worked up about. When I asked what discrepancies, Thane's hand found a pen and turned it over twice before he answered. Statistical noise, probably. Dorian saw patterns everywhere in his last few months. I told him to take a vacation. Renata Coe, a junior actuary 2 desks from Voss's office, cried for real, which is rarer than people think, and told me Voss had been kind to her when she started, patient with a field that chews up its newcomers. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that Voss had asked her 3 weeks back to pull 5 years of claims data on a specific policy tier, high-value term life, 7-figure payouts, and had seemed different afterward, quieter, like he was carrying something he didn't want to put down in front of people. Griffindale, from underwriting, was a different animal entirely. Younger, sharper suit than his salary should afford, and vaguely amused by the whole exercise of being questioned. Dorian and I disagreed about methodology, he said. Constantly. That's not a motive, Mr. Goodwin. That's a Tuesday in this business. When I asked what the disagreement concerned, he smiled in a way that told me he'd prepared the answer. Actuarial philosophy. Whether the tables should account for correlated risk events. Dull as dishwater, I promise you. I didn't promise him anything back. Last was Harold Voss's brother-in-law, a man named Curtis Aldrich who, oddly, also worked at the firm, 2 floors down in claims processing, and who'd gotten Voss the job 19 years ago as a favor to his sister. Curtis wept a little, angrily, the way men do when grief and something else are tangled together, and they can't separate the strands. He mentioned money, Dorian's, or rather the family's, tied up in a trust his sister worried about, and then backed away from the subject so fast, I nearly got whiplash watching him do it. None of them, on the surface, looked like a killer. That's the trouble with the ones who don't murder for love or hate. There's no obvious seam to pull. But 4 different people had given me 4 different versions of one fact. Dorian Voss had found something in his own company's numbers that had unsettled him badly enough to change his habits, guard his words, and eventually die, with 7 of those numbers written on his arm, like he was trying to save them from whoever might come looking. Inspector Kramer showed up at the brownstone that evening uninvited, which is his preferred method of arrival, dropping his hat on the hall table, like he owned the hook it hung from. "Wolfe," he said, settling into the red leather chair without an invitation extended. "Word's going around that you've got a client interested in the Voss business. I'll save you some legwork. It's closed. ME ruled natural causes, full stop, and the department doesn't have the appetite to reopen a coronary death because a widow doesn't like the timing of it." "The chess clock," Wolfe said, without looking up from the beer Fritz had just brought him. "Does the department's appetite extend to a hobby shop timepiece, purchased new, found stopped on a dead man's desk?" "People buy weird things," Kramer said. "Maybe he was going to take up chess. Maybe it's a paperweight. You want me to arrest a man for owning novelty items? And the numbers on his arm?" Kramer's jaw worked. Actuaries write numbers on themselves. It's practically their hobby. Maybe he was jotting something down and didn't have paper handy. "I've seen weirder in 40 years of stiffs, Wolfe, and most of it means exactly nothing." "The origami," I put in, because somebody had to. "His widow says he liked to fidget with paper when he was thinking," Kramer said, which was news to me and, from the flat way he delivered it, sounded like something he'd been handed rather than dug up himself. "Look, I talked to the ME personally. Clean coronary event. No toxicology flags, no signs of struggle, no forced entry to the building. Badge access logs show only people who belonged there. You want a murder, Wolfe, you need a murderer, and there isn't one sitting in that building." "Toxicology," Wolfe repeated, tasting the word like it disagreed with him. "A full panel or the standard screen?" "Standard," Kramer admitted, after a pause that told me he already sensed where this was headed. "You don't run a full tox screen on every 50-year-old with a bad ticker, Wolfe. Budgets don't work that way." "Then the department's conclusion," Wolfe said, "rests upon the absence of evidence they never troubled themselves to seek." "That is not a finding, Inspector. That is a shrug wearing a badge." Kramer stood, color rising the way it does right before he decides he's had enough of Wolfe's tone for one evening. "You get me something real. A poison, a name, a motive that isn't the widow has a feeling, and I'll reopen it myself. Until then, it's a closed file, and I'd remind you that harassing a grieving company isn't a hobby I'd recommend." He collected his hat and let himself out, which was its own kind of admission. Kramer only slams doors when he's not entirely sure of his own ground. Wolfe sat with his beer a long moment after the door closed. "Archie, the department examined the death and found nothing suspicious, because they were not equipped, nor inclined, to look for the specific thing that killed him. That is not reassurance. That is opportunity, for whoever engineered this. Get Doc Vollmer on the telephone. I want an independent toxicology consultation, and I want it discussed in terms a coroner's office would never think to request." Doc Vollmer. Once we got him the case file, and a very reluctant nod from the ME's office to release a tissue sample. Took 4 days, and came back with something that made even his usually unshakable voice tighten on the phone. Wolfe, this wasn't his heart failing on its own. There's a compound here. Not common, not something that shows on a standard screen, but it mimics acute cardiac arrest almost perfectly if you're not specifically hunting for it. It's derived from a plant alkaloid, used historically in minute, controlled doses for arrhythmia treatment. In the dose he received, it would stop a healthy heart within 20 to 40 minutes, and it clears the bloodstream fast enough that a standard tox panel, run days later, would miss it entirely. Administration? Wolfe asked. Could be ingested, could be injected. No needle mark I can confirm at this stage, so I'd lean ingested. Something in food or drink, taken shortly before he died. That put the time of death against the chess clock in a new light. 6:47. If the compound worked in 20 to 40 minutes, whatever killed him had entered his system between 6 and half past. I went back to the 11th floor the next morning to walk Voss's last hours, and that's where the first crack in the story showed itself. Renata Coe told me, again, gently and without prompting, that Voss had stayed late that Tuesday. Not unusual. He stayed late most Tuesdays doing what the office called quarter cleanup, reconciling the month's mortality tables. What was unusual was that Griffin Dale had also stayed, which Renata mentioned only because she remembered being surprised, since Dale was famous around the office for leaving at 5:30 sharp, rain or deadline. I asked Dale about it directly, watching his face for the tell. He didn't flinch, which itself told me something. A man surprised by a question flinches. A man who's rehearsed his answer doesn't. Sure, I stayed, he said. Dorian asked me to. Wanted a second pair of eyes on a reconciliation before he closed the quarter. We had coffee, his, not mine, I don't drink the stuff, and went through it together until around 6:30. Then I left. He was fine when I left, Mr. Goodwin. Tired, maybe. Fine. His coffee, I said. Who made it? The break room machine makes it. Anyone could have poured a cup. I certainly didn't hover over the man's mug like a bodyguard. That was the structural flaw. Not in Dale's story exactly, but in the shape of the evening itself. A shared coffee, a convenient departure at 6:30, a death clock stopped 17 minutes later, too clean an alibi and too precise a window sitting right next to each other, and Dale delivering both without a single crack in his voice. I called it in to Wolfe that evening. He listened without interrupting, which is his way of telling me he's already 3 steps ahead and waiting to see if I'll catch up. Archie, he said finally, a man who leaves at 5:30 every day of his working life and remains until 6:30 on the single evening his colleague dies of a rare and untraceable poison. That is either the unluckiest coincidence in the history of actuarial science, or it is precisely as convenient as it looks. Find out what Mr. Dale's finances look like. I suspect the numbers will tell us more than his manner ever will. 2 days later, a folder arrived at the brownstone by messenger, no return address, containing a single printed page, a bank statement, photocopied, showing a wire transfer of $40,000 into an account belonging to Renata Coe, dated the day before Voss died. A sticky note was affixed to the top in block capitals. This is who killed him. I brought it to Wolfe before I'd even taken my coat off. He turned it over, studied the paper stock, held it to the light, and set it down with the particular disgust he reserves for things trying too hard to convince him. Too clean, he said. Observe, Archie. The transfer date is precisely calibrated. The day before, not the day of. Not a week prior. Close enough to suggest motive, distant enough to avoid the appearance of a same-day panic transaction, which anyone attempting to frame a party would think to avoid. That is not a discovery. That is a construction. Could still be real, I said, because somebody's got to hold up the other end. It could be entirely real and still tell us nothing about murder, Wolfe said. A young woman receiving money the day before her superior's death is suspicious only to a mind already primed to suspect her, which is precisely the mind this document was manufactured to produce. Who benefits from Miss Coe's arrest, Archie? Not the truth. Someone with a use for a convenient conclusion. I went and asked Renata about it directly, watching Whistler's earlier read of her replay in my mind. An easy sit, no hesitation. the dog's version of a character reference. She went white, then answered without hedging, which liars rarely manage on the first try. "That's my student loan refinancing," she said, and pulled up the transaction on her phone without being asked. $40,000 from a federal consolidation program. Paperwork dated weeks in advance. Nothing furtive about it at all. "I can show you the whole application if you want. I've been trying to get this approved since March." It checked out inside 20 minutes on the phone with her loan servicer, who confirmed the disbursement date had been locked in long before Voss ever touched a bad cup of coffee, which left the question of who had photocopied her bank statement, timed a sticky note to land on a real but innocuous transaction, and mailed it to a detective's brownstone with enough confidence to believe it would stick. "Somebody inside that building has access to financial records they shouldn't," I told Wolfe, "and enough nerve to manufacture a frame rather than just wait for us to lose interest." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "And a manufactured frame requires knowledge of two things: the existence of a plausible target, and enough proximity to that target's financial life to select a transaction convincing enough to misread. Miss Coe is, by every account including the dog's, an unlikely murderer, but someone believed we would think otherwise, which means someone is worried enough about our proximity to the truth to spend effort steering us away from it. Fear, Archie, is a more honest witness than any document. Someone is afraid of exactly where we're looking." Wolfe's version of domestic investigation rarely looks like investigation at all, which is the point. He had me spend the better part of a day asking Ashcombe and Vane's staff a series of questions so dull I nearly fell asleep conducting them myself. Questions about coffee habits, parking assignments, who ordered lunch from where, whose badge beeped in at what hour on ordinary Tuesdays going back 3 months. The dullness was deliberate. Wolfe's theory, delivered to me over breakfast with the particular patience he reserves for explaining himself to me slowly, was this: a killer operating on cold financial logic, rather than passion, leaves footprints in routine, not in drama. "A crime of the heart announces itself in behavior out of character," he said. "A crime of the ledger hides inside behavior that looks, on its surface, exactly like every other day." So I asked about badge logs, and found that Griffindale's card had clocked unusually late departures, after 6, on 4 separate Tuesdays in the preceding 2 months, each one coinciding, according to Priya Nandan's records, with the same quarterly reconciliation cycle that had kept him there the night Voss died. 4 Tuesdays, 4 late nights, all with Voss. I asked about the break room coffee machine, expecting nothing, and got something. It required a proprietary pod, restocked weekly by a vending contractor, and Dale, alone among the department, had a habit, confirmed by 3 separate co-workers independently, of bringing his own thermos, rather than using the shared machine at all. "Never touches the stuff," Renata had told me, and 2 others echoed it without prompting. A man who never drinks the office coffee, staying late 4 separate times over 2 months, specifically on the evenings his soon-to-be-dead colleague was also working alone, is either remarkably disciplined about caffeine or remarkably careful about what he allows himself to be near. I asked about parking, about lunch orders, about who'd requested time off recently. The last one turned up something Wolfe found more interesting than I expected. Griffindale had filed for, and been approved for, an extended unpaid leave beginning the following month. Destination unlisted on the internal form, but Priya, digging a little deeper on my behalf, found a forwarding address for his final paycheck: a property management company in the Caymans. A man planning to leave the country within weeks of his colleague's death, Wolfe said that evening, is either coincidentally fortunate in his timing, or he is closing a book he does not intend to reopen. Last, and almost by accident, I asked about the firm's investment club, a casual thing, a handful of employees pooling money into a shared brokerage account for fun, nothing regulated, nothing official. Dale had joined 8 months prior, so notably had Marcus Thane, and according to the club's informal ledger, which Priya produced with a shrug like it hardly mattered, the club's largest single position, nearly 60% of its holdings, sat in a small biotech firm developing life insurance risk modeling software. The same kind of modeling software Ashcombe and Vane used to price the very policies Voss had been quietly investigating before he died. The disruption came on its own schedule, the way these things do. 3 days into my dull question campaign, Priya called the brownstone in a state close to panic. Ashcombe and Vane's entire mortality database, the master file Voss had been auditing before he died, had been wiped from the shared server overnight, and the only backup, an air-gapped external drive kept in a locked cabinet on the 11th floor, was missing entirely. Someone with admin access did this deliberately, Priya said. IT's already confirmed it wasn't a crash. Deletion logs, timestamp 2:14 this morning, and the cabinet lock wasn't forced. Whoever took the drive had a key or knew the code. I relayed it to Wolfe, who received the news with the closest thing to satisfaction I'd seen from him on this case. The killer is no longer confident the frame constructed for Miss Coase will hold, he said. Destroying the source data was always the more elegant solution, and its lateness suggests panic rather than planning. A second, hastier move, layered atop the first, poorly conceived one. Whoever did this believed the drive contained something specific enough to convict, and believed it enough to risk a second crime to bury it. Bramble, oddly, is the one who put me onto the next piece, though it took me half a day to understand what he was telling me. He'd started, over the 2 weeks of this case, sleeping by the front hall radiator, rather than his usual spot near the office window. A small shift, but a fixed shift, the kind Wolfe's taught me never to dismiss. When I finally connected it, it wasn't about the case directly. It was about my own habits changing without me noticing, tracking mail and visitors to the brownstone more anxiously than usual, because whoever had sent that fabricated bank statement clearly knew our address. The dog was reading me, not the case, but it reminded me to check whether anyone at Ashcombe and Vane had shown unusual interest in Wolfe's brownstone specifically. Priya, when I asked, remembered something. Griffin Dale had asked her, weeks earlier, in what she'd taken as idle office gossip, whether she knew which detective agency the Voss family used to nose around. She'd mentioned Wolfe's name in passing at the time, not thinking twice about it. Dale had known who we were before Eleanor Voss ever rang our bell. That reframed the missing drive entirely. This wasn't a killer improvising against pressure he hadn't anticipated. This was a killer who had known, almost from the start, that Wolfe might come asking, and had built the fabricated frame against Renata Coe as a contingency, ready to deploy the moment real scrutiny arrived, which meant the missing hard drive wasn't panic at all. It was the next planned step, executed slightly early, because our questions had arrived slightly sooner than expected. He isn't reacting to us, Archie, Wolfe said, when I laid it out. He is running a sequence, and we have simply forced him to advance to the next stage of it, ahead of schedule. Find out what that drive actually contained. Not the whole database, what Voss himself had flagged inside it. That is the document worth killing twice to erase. It took Renata Coe, of all people, to crack it open. Not the drive itself, which stayed missing, but the shape of what had been on it. She remembered, with the specific clarity of someone who'd spent weeks quietly frightened, the exact query Voss had asked her to run 3 weeks before he died. 5 years of claims data on high-value term life policies, cross-referenced against a second dataset she hadn't thought to mention before, because at the time it had seemed unrelated. That second dataset was short sale activity on a small basket of publicly traded life insurance and reinsurance stocks. Wolfe sat with that for the better part of an hour, beer going flat at his elbow, before he laid it out for me in full. Consider the mechanics, Archie. An actuarial firm prices risk for insurers based on mortality tables, the statistical likelihood that a given class of policyholder will die within a given window. If a man inside that firm possessed both the mortality data and knowledge of which specific high-value policyholders were statistically due to die soon, he would possess something extraordinarily valuable to a particular kind of investor. Foreknowledge of upcoming, entirely legal insurance payouts, and by extension, foreknowledge of exactly which reinsurance companies would soon post unexpected losses. You're saying somebody was shorting the reinsurers, I said, right before a wave of claims hit them. I am saying more than that. A wave of naturally occurring claims would already be profitable knowledge for a short position, if one could predict it in advance with any precision. And predicting death with precision is, after all, the entire profession housed on that 11th floor. But Dorian Voss did not discover a pattern of natural predictions being traded upon. He discovered a pattern too precise to be natural at all. A cluster of deaths among policyholders that matched, almost exactly, the mortality windows someone had already bet against, weeks before those deaths occurred. Someone was not merely predicting death, Archie. Someone was assisting it, within a population large and dispersed enough that no single death would ever draw suspicion, and then trading on the certainty of their own hand. I sat with that a moment, the cold shape of it settling in. So it's not personal at all. Voss wasn't killed because somebody hated him. Voss was an obstacle, Wolfe said, in precisely the way a decimal error is an obstacle to a ledger that must balance. He found the pattern. He began, according to his widow, to walk it back through carefully before he spoke, which tells us he had not yet identified the specific hand behind it, only the shape of the scheme itself. That made him dangerous in theory rather than in practice, but a sufficiently disciplined killer does not wait for danger to become practical. He removes the variable the moment it appears on the page, and the numbers on his arm. His own attempt, I suspect, at preserving what he'd found once he understood he might not have time to write it properly. 7 figures, likely a policy number or an account identifier, committed to the one surface he trusted a poisoner not to think to examine before the coroner did. A man dying by inches, Archie, in the last rational minutes available to him, choosing to become his own evidence. That was the core of it, the how, laid bare. What remained was the who, and Wolfe already had a name circling the center of his logic like a hawk, deciding when to stoop. Wolfe didn't move for 2 days after that, which is its own kind of motion where he's concerned. He sat with his beer and his orchid schedule and refused, with maddening consistency, to tell me who he suspected. Though I'd have bet the brownstone's mortgage it was Griffin Dale. Premature accusation, he said, when I pushed, is a luxury afforded only to men who enjoy being wrong in public. I will not hand a clever killer the knowledge of how close we stand until the ground beneath him is solid enough to hold his weight when he falls. What he did instead was let the silence work. He had me return to Ashcombe and Vane twice more, asking nothing new, simply present, visibly still investigating, still occupying space in the periphery of every office on that floor. He wanted the killer uncertain, not cornered. A man who believes he's still ahead behaves very differently from a man who knows the walls are closing. It worked on some of them plainly. Marcus Thane grew visibly thinner around the eyes, snapping at Priya over trivial scheduling matters he'd never have noticed before. Curtis Aldrich, the brother-in-law, started avoiding the 11th floor entirely, taking his lunches 2 floors down where I couldn't easily reach him, which told me his earlier discomfort about family money had been exactly what it looked like, an unrelated embarrassment, not a murder. Griffin Dale, notably, didn't change at all. Same clipped courtesy, same rehearsed ease, same thermos of coffee he never shared. If anything, he seemed to enjoy my continued presence, once even offering, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, to save Mr. Goodwin some shoe leather, by summarizing what he assumed I'd already concluded. A performance of helpfulness so smooth, it told me more than any confession could have. Wolfe, informed of this by phone each evening, absorbed it without comment beyond a single instruction. Continue as you are, Archie. A man that composed under sustained attention is either entirely innocent or has rehearsed his innocence more thoroughly than most men rehearse anything in their lives. I do not believe Mr. Dale is entirely innocent. On the 3rd evening, Bramble gave us something neither of us expected. Eleanor Voss had come by the brownstone again, ostensibly to check on our progress, and Bramble, who'd read her the first time as a woman carrying grief rather than guilt, broke from that pattern entirely. A low, sustained attention, aimed not at her, but at the folder of financial documents she'd brought along. Documents she said belonged to her late husband's personal accounts. The dog wasn't reading her. He was reading something in the paper itself. Some trace, or handling his nose, had caught that mine couldn't. Wolfe had me examine the folder that night after she'd left, page by page under better light than the front hall offered. And there, tucked between 2 unrelated bank statements, was a single sheet Voss had apparently printed at home rather than at the office. A partial ledger, hand-annotated in his cramped writing, tracking short positions against 7 specific reinsurance tickers. 7. The same number as the digits on his arm. Wolfe turned the ledger page over twice under the lamp before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had the particular flatness it takes on when a piece locks into place with more force than he'd anticipated. The chess clock, Archie. Recall its purpose. A device that measures elapsed time in a game played between 2 opposing parties, each racing against the other's clock as much as their own. What does that suggest to you, given what we now understand? I turned it over. A countdown. Somebody's timing something. More precisely, a metaphor, chosen by a killer with a taste for cleverness he could not resist indulging, even in the commission of murder. The mechanism Voss uncovered depended entirely on timing, a short position placed against a stock, timed to mature precisely when an engineered death produced a claims spike the market hadn't priced in. Too early, and the position bleeds money waiting. Too late, and the market has already adjusted. The profit gone. The clock stopped at 6:47, was not a random object left behind by a careless killer. It was signed work, a message, whether Voss's killer intended anyone to read it correctly or not, announcing that this death, like the others, was a matter of precise timing rather than passion. And the crane? Origami, Wolfe said, is an act of transformation performed upon a flat, ordinary object, a single sheet of paper folded, through careful and repeated steps, into something else entirely, its original form no longer recognizable. I put it to you that the killer folded that policy page not as a taunt directed at Voss, but as an admission directed at himself, that he had taken something as flat and ordinary as an insurance form, and folded it, through careful and repeated application of pressure, into a machine for producing money out of death. He could not resist leaving the confession in a form no one but its author would ever be positioned to read. I sat with the ugliness of that a moment. That's not somebody covering their tracks. That's somebody proud of the work. Precisely why I do not believe Mr. Dale worked alone, Wolfe said. A man executing another's design does not indulge in cleverness for its own sake. He executes, and he leaves. A man signing his own crime with symbolic flourish is a man who considers himself the architect, not the instrument. Marcus Thane's continued unease troubles me less as evidence of guilt than as evidence of complicity in a scheme he did not fully understand until it produced a body. I believe Mr. Dale built the mechanism. I believe Mr. Thane, willingly or otherwise, provided him the access and the silence required to run it. And the ledger, Voss printed it at home rather than the office, because he no longer trusted the office. Wolfe said, a man who begins to suspect the machinery around him removes his evidence from the machinery's reach. He simply ran out of time to remove himself as well. Tomorrow, Archie, I want you to return to that building and ask Mr. Dale one very specific, very boring question about his investment club's brokerage statements. His answer to that single dull question will tell us whether we are finally standing close enough to see him clearly. The question Wolfe gave me was almost comically small. Ask Griffin Dale, in passing, whether the investment club's brokerage account used a single shared login or individual credentials for each member. I asked it the next afternoon over coffee I didn't drink either, in a tone calibrated for maximum insignificance, tucked between 2 questions about parking validation and the office holiday schedule. Dale answered without hesitation. Shared login, he said. Everyone used the same credentials, simpler that way for a casual club nobody wanted to fuss over, and moved the conversation along so smoothly I nearly missed what Wolfe had actually been fishing for. A shared login, Wolfe said that evening, with visible satisfaction, means any trade executed through that account is, on paper, attributable to the group as a whole, rather than to any single member. It is the perfect structure for a man wishing to place a large, precisely timed short position without his own name attached to the individual transaction. Mr. Dale has just confirmed, without realizing it, that he built himself a mechanism of deniability before he ever needed one. So now what? We go to Kramer with a shared login? Kramer requires a name and a motive he can put before a jury, not an architecture of convenience. We require bait specific enough to make Mr. Dale believe his structure has already been breached, and clumsy enough in appearance that he will not suspect it came from us. The bait, when Wolfe constructed it, was elegant in its dullness. He had Priya Nandan, who by now trusted us more than she trusted her own compliance department, quietly circulate, through entirely legitimate internal channels, a memo announcing that the firm's outside auditors, in cooperation with the ongoing internal review following Voss's death, would be requesting individual trading records from every member of the informal investment club, effective the following Monday, as a standard courtesy given recent events. It wasn't a lie, precisely. Priya had in fact been asked by the firm's actual compliance office to consider exactly such a review, prompted by Voss's death, and nothing more sinister. Wolfe's contribution was timing its announcement to land like a trap rather than a formality, and trusting that a man who'd built deniability into his crime from the start would recognize, the moment his cover was threatened, that the walls he'd constructed were about to be tested by people with the authority to actually look behind them. If Mr. Dale is innocent, Wolfe said, he will greet Monday's audit with mild irritation, as any honest man greets bureaucracy. If he is guilty, he will move to protect himself before Monday arrives, and a man moving to protect a 5-year scheme, under sudden, unexpected pressure, rarely moves with the same precision he used to build it in the first place. Archie, I want you at that building constantly between now and Monday. Watch what he does with his evenings. A trapped animal reveals its den. Dale left the office at 5:47 the following Thursday. Not his usual 5:30, not the suspicious 6:30 of the night Voss died, but a strange, unsettled in-between that told me, before anything else did, that his rhythm had finally cracked. I followed him 3 blocks to a self-storage facility on the east side, the kind with a keypad entry and no attendant after 6, and watched from across the street as he let himself into a unit on the ground floor, with the unhurried care of a man who believes he's alone. He wasn't. Bramble was in the car with me, Wolfe's insistence, over my objections, on the grounds that a dog's nose does not require a warrant. And the moment Dale re-emerged 11 minutes later, carrying a slim metal case, Bramble came off the back seat, with the same alert posture he'd shown the morning Eleanor Voss first rang our bell. Not aggression, recognition, something about that case, or the hands carrying it, had crossed whatever internal register the dog uses to sort danger from routine. Dale didn't go home. He drove instead to a 24-hour parcel service, 2 neighborhoods over, and through the storefront glass I watched him address a shipping label, seal the metal case inside a padded envelope, and hand it across the counter with the particular briskness of a man eager to have a thing out of his own possession. I couldn't intercept it there without tipping our hand entirely, so I did the only useful thing available to me. I memorized the clerk's face, noted the counter number, and called Wolfe from the car the moment Dale pulled away. He's shipping something, I said. A case, metal, small enough to carry one-handed. Storage unit under his name, or somebody's name. I'll get that tomorrow. He's spooked, Wolfe. Whatever's in that case, he wants it somewhere he can't be connected to it come Monday. Wolfe was quiet a moment, and when he spoke, there was an edge of real urgency in it, rare enough that it stopped me cold. A man attempting to sever himself from physical evidence 3 days before an audit is a man who believes that evidence, if found in his possession, would end him. Archie, I want that parcel's destination before it leaves the city. Legally, if the clerk will cooperate with a story plausible enough to hold. Less legally, if he will not. This is the moment. If we let it pass us by, we may not see repeated. I went back into that parcel shop within the hour, and $30, and a story about a family emergency mailing lighter. Learned the case was addressed to a private mailbox service in Wilmington, Delaware. A state, I happen to know from years of dull financial cases, that specializes in exactly the kind of shell arrangements a man builds when he wants an asset to exist somewhere the law finds inconvenient to reach. Dale wasn't running yet, but he was packing the getaway car one careful, deniable piece at a time. Wolfe didn't want the parcel intercepted. A stolen shipment proves nothing, except that somebody stole a shipment, he pointed out, and gives a clever man grounds to claim harassment, rather than confront the contents of the case itself. What he wanted instead was Griffin Dale's own hand delivering the truth to us. without Dale realizing he'd done it. That meant Curtis Aldrich, of all people, turned out to be the lever. Aldrich, still shaken from weeks of his own unrelated anxieties about family money, had never fully trusted Dale. A resentment, it turned out, going back years to a mishandled trade in the investment club that had cost Aldrich a few $1,000s he'd never quite forgiven. I found him on his lunch break 2 floors down from the 11th, and instead of questioning him, I simply told him the truth. That Dale had shipped something out of state 3 days before an audit that Aldrich himself, as a club member, would also be subject to. Aldrich's face did something complicated, fear and old resentment working out their arithmetic in real time, and by the end of our conversation he'd agreed, with visible reluctance and Wolfe's assurance, that his own minor financial embarrassments would remain his own business, to ask Dale one small favor on our behalf, to request, casually, as one club member to another, that Dale forward him a copy of our full trading history, just so I'm not caught flat-footed Monday. Dale, cornered without knowing he was cornered, made his mistake there. He sent Aldrich not a clean summary, but the actual underlying spreadsheet, hastily scrubbed, but not scrubbed well enough, still carrying, buried in the file's metadata, a login timestamp trail that Priya's IT contact was able to recover in full. Every trade Dale had personally executed through the shared account, timestamped against the exact windows of 7 policyholder deaths going back 18 months. Each trade placed between 2 and 11 days before the corresponding claim was filed. 7 trades, 7 deaths, 7 digits on a dead man's arm. Wolfe received the printout at his desk with something almost like reverence, the closest he comes to open satisfaction on a case's darker turns. There it is, Archie. Not a confession. Better than a confession. A pattern too precise for coincidence, too specific for a jury to wave away as circumstantial, and delivered into our hands by the very man who believed he was covering his tracks by scrubbing a spreadsheet, rather than destroying it outright. He still doesn't know we have it. No, Wolfe said, and he will not know until tomorrow evening, when I intend for him to learn it in the company of everyone else who has spent these past weeks wondering whether they themselves might be blamed for what one man built entirely alone. Wolfe assembled them in his own office the following evening. Eleanor Voss, Marcus Thane, Renata Coe, Curtis Aldrich, Priya Nandan as the firm's representative, and Griffin Dale, who arrived last, composed as ever, and took the red leather chair as though he owned it, which was, I suppose, its own kind of confession. Wolfe let the silence sit before he began. Bramble stationed at the office window, Whistler near my desk, both dogs settled in the fixed positions that meant, whatever came next, the house itself was ready for it. 18 months ago, Wolfe said, Mr. Dale conceived of a mechanism as elegant as it is monstrous. Ashcombe and Vane possessed, in its ordinary course of business, the single most valuable piece of information a man in his position could exploit. Reliable statistical models, predicting which classes of high-value policyholders were most likely to die, and when. This knowledge, used honestly, prices insurance premiums. Used dishonestly, in the hands of a man willing to intervene in nature's timing, it becomes a machine for converting death into certain profit. Dale's composure didn't crack. Not yet. But his hands had gone very still in his lap. Mr. Dale identified 7 policyholders across 18 months, whose actuarial profiles made their deaths statistically plausible within a narrow window. Elderly or ill, or simply unlucky enough that a hastened end would draw no particular scrutiny. He accelerated each of their deaths by means Doc Vollmer has only begun to trace, using a compound difficult to detect unless specifically sought. And in each case, days before the death occurred, he placed a short position against reinsurance stocks certain to suffer when the resulting claims came due, using, for deniability, an investment club account nominally shared among several innocent colleagues, Mr. Thane among them. Thane made a small, wounded sound but didn't deny it. Dorian Voss, Wolfe continued, in the ordinary diligence of his role, noticed what should never have been noticeable, a cluster of deaths, correlating too precisely with market activity that preceded them. He began, carefully, cautiously, to walk the pattern back to its source, uncertain yet of the hand behind it. That caution cost him nothing but time, and time was the one thing Mr. Dale could not permit him to have. Voss became the 8th name on a list he did not yet know he belonged to. "This is theater," Dale said, voice even. "Interesting theater. You have no evidence tying me to any compound, any death but Voss's, and even there. I have your own trading history," Wolfe said, "recovered intact from a spreadsheet you believed sufficiently scrubbed, showing 7 trades placed by your own login credentials, each one timed against a death you engineered. I have a storage unit rented in your name, and a case shipped 3 days ago to a private mailbox in Wilmington that I expect, upon proper legal inquiry, to contain records far more damning than the digital trail you left behind by accident. And I have the numbers Dorian Voss wrote upon his own arm as he died, which match precisely the account identifier tied to your final trade." The room held its breath, the way rooms do, right before something breaks, and Wolfe, unhurried, turned his attention to clearing the wreckage of suspicion he'd allowed to gather around the innocent. "Miss Coe," he said, "you were framed, crudely and cynically, by a man who understood that a young, financially unremarkable employee makes an easy target for suspicion when a convenient document is placed before eyes, eager to close a case quickly. Your loan disbursement was legitimate, your grief for your mentor was genuine, and I regret the discomfort this investigation caused you in confirming what should never have required confirmation at all." Renata, still pale, managed a small nod. "Mr. Aldrich," Wolfe continued, "your anxieties concerning your sister's family trust, and your old resentment over a mishandled trade some years past, are matters entirely separate from this crime, embarrassing perhaps, but not criminal, and I have no intention of pursuing them further than tonight's necessary conversation already has. Your assistance, however reluctantly given, proved decisive." Curtis exhaled like a man setting down a weight he'd carried for weeks. "Mr. Thane," Wolfe said, and here his tone hardened, "your position is more delicate. You permitted your name to lend legitimacy to an investment club whose trading patterns you either failed to examine or examined and chose not to question, because its returns benefited you as surely as they benefited Mr. Dale. I do not accuse you of murder. I accuse you of a willful blindness that made murder easier to commit and harder to detect, and I suspect the firm's compliance office, and quite possibly the SEC, will take considerably less generous a view of that distinction than I have chosen to tonight." Thane said nothing, which was, in its way, everything. "And you, madam," Wolfe said, turning to Eleanor Voss, "brought us a chess clock, a paper crane, and 7 numbers, written in your husband's own blood-marked hand, and trusted that somewhere in that strange arithmetic lay a truth worth pursuing. You were correct in every particular, and your husband, in his final rational minutes, chose to become the evidence that would eventually convict the man who killed him. That is not a small thing. Few men, dying, think so clearly of anyone but themselves." Dale, through all of it, had gone very quiet, the composure finally beginning to slip at its edges, not into confession, not yet, but into the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic on how much longer his silence could hold. "One matter remains, Mr. Dale," Wolfe said, "the compound itself. Doc Vollmer's analysis will, in time, trace its origin, and origins of that kind are rarely as untraceable as their purchasers believe. I would suggest, for whatever leniency it might earn you, that you consider speaking plainly before that trace is completed, rather than after." Dale didn't confess that night. Men like him rarely do in the moment, with an audience watching, but the trading records, the storage unit, and the shipped case, once Kramer's department finally moved on them with a warrant issued the following morning, told the story with a completeness that made denial a formality, rather than a defense. The case in Wilmington held exactly what Wolfe had suspected. A small ledger, handwritten in Dale's own hand, tracking not just the trades, but the sourcing of the compound itself, obtained, patiently, over 2 years, from a research supplier who sold small quantities for legitimate arrhythmia studies, and had never thought to question a customer with a plausible academic cover story. 7 deaths, 7 trades, 7 lines in a book kept with the same obsessive tidiness Dale had brought to every spreadsheet of his career. What struck me hardest, reading Kramer's eventual summary over coffee at the Brownstone, wasn't the cruelty of it, cruelty I'd seen before, in uglier and more personal forms. It was the absence of any cruelty at all. Dale hadn't hated a single one of his 7 victims. He hadn't known most of them beyond a policy number and an actuarial profile. He'd selected them the way a man selects stocks, for their statistical convenience, their likelihood of dying soon enough to matter, and quietly enough to pass unnoticed. And he'd killed Dorian Voss for the same reason he'd killed the others, because the numbers required it, and Voss had become, in Dale's own cold accounting, simply one more variable that needed resolving. There is a particular horror, Wolfe said, that evening, working through a beer with less evident satisfaction than a solved case usually brings him, in a killer who feels nothing at all. Passion, even ugly passion, admits that the victim mattered enough to provoke it. Mr. Dale's victims mattered to him only as entries in a ledger, interchangeable, replaceable, valuable only insofar as their deaths produced a favorable trade. That is not the absence of a motive, Archie. It is a motive so thoroughly divorced from humanity that it hardly deserves the name. Marcus Thane, for his part, resigned within the week, under investigation for the willful blindness Wolfe had named to his face, though whether any charge would stick remained, for now, an open question the SEC would spend months untangling. Renata Coe, cleared entirely, sent a card to the brownstone that Fritz read aloud at dinner, awkward and sincere, in the way of someone still young enough to believe thank you notes matter, which they do. Eleanor Voss came by once more, a week later, not for news but simply, she said, to see the room where her husband's death had finally been taken seriously. She sat for a while in the client chair, said very little, and left with something in her posture that hadn't been there before. Not peace, exactly, but the particular relief of a question finally answered, even by an answer with no comfort in it at all. Fritz made shad roe that night, which he does perhaps twice a season, when he judges the occasion worthy, and Wolfe ate 2 full servings without a single comment on the day's ugliness, which is his own private way of marking that a case has been properly closed and need not be discussed at the dinner table. I asked him, over the coffee that followed, whether it bothered him more than most, the coldness of it. A man killing 7 strangers and 1 colleague without a flicker of the hatred that at least makes murder comprehensible, if never forgivable. It bothers me precisely as much as it should, Wolfe said, which is to say considerably, and I intend to forget the particulars as quickly as decency allows, once the trial concludes and Mr. Dale's ledger has finished its work in a courtroom rather than a brokerage account. A man who kills for love or rage or fear at least confesses that the world moved him. Mr. Dale's world was never moved by anything beyond a spreadsheet's bottom line, and I find that, on balance, considerably harder to sit with than any crime of passion I have encountered in this chair. Outside, the evening had settled into the particular hush that follows a solved case. Not silence exactly, the city never quite manages that, but a lowering of some private volume that only Wolfe and I, and maybe Fritz, ever seemed to notice. Bramble had already resettled at the window, nose against the glass, tracking whatever ordinary Tuesday evening business the street offered him, now that there was nothing more urgent to sense. Whistler had taken up his post near my desk, chin on his paws, the long, deliberate study he brings to every stranger finally at rest, because for now, at least, no strangers remained who required it. Wolfe finished his coffee, glanced at the clock, an ordinary clock, not the strange stopped thing that had started this whole business, and rose, with his usual complaint about the hour, to begin the walk upstairs to bed. 9 hours, Archie, he said at the door, until the orchids require me again. See that nothing disturbs it. I told him I'd do my best, which is what I always tell him, and which is, more often than either of us admits, exactly true.